Hey, what's up, everyone? This is the 73rd opening that I'd like to share with you, which is the Sailboat opening. This is kind of like a very, fairly common opening that is popular among players who play as white, and they start off with the diagonal opening. And it's quite typical that it leads out into the cow sequence and kind of leads to this sailboat sequence. So this is one opening that you might want to consider if you're pretty much an intermediate player, just starting off not too long, and this opening is fairly simple for you to just play out deeply. And I think most of the time Black would tend to follow the book sequence. So let's start off with the sequence f5, followed by the diagonal cut f6, e6, and d6. So that's kind of like the lead into the diagonal opening sequence. Thereafter, when Black plays the cow opening, which is probably something that you might find is the most common opening, when Black chooses to respond against the white diagonal opening, you then have e3 to cut into the center. So typically you have two options. So e3 is essentially the lead into sailboat opening. So you play e3, and then Black would then kind of play d3 over here just to cut into the center. So this is quite a standard book opening. So among 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of playable moves, you choose to play the best one that is highlighted, which I think most players would tend to learn the recommended move, which is at g5. So over here, even though Black has a few options like d7, e2, f2, but the tendency is for Black to regroup to f3 because it's probably into the center of the 16 squares, and at the same time it forms a more kind of regular and compact shape as opposed to playing to the top e2 or f2 options. So over here, when you play b5, you essentially kind of complete that sailboat. I guess it's pretty obvious in terms of the shape. So the white color disc at the bottom almost looks like a boat, and then of course the black part on the top looks like a sail. So it's kind of like a sailboat. So this is essentially the sequence. So the typical follow-up is for Black. I think most of the time you would expect Black to know the follow-up sequence. So Black, and then you can then choose either B6, which is the most common response, followed by C4. I think it's also fairly common. So one of the styles that the Japanese like to play, or most of the top diagonal players like to vary it at this point, is to play D7, and D7 can actually be fairly effective. So the typical sequence over here would be for Black to jump into e7, you jump in, and then essentially when Black plays, I think the tendency is you would want to kind of form g4 potentially. h5 doesn't really seem to kind of come to you immediately in terms of just trying to keep a few disc flips and at the same time maintaining a compact shape. So this is something that you might explore as white. This could be counterintuitive. Assuming Black does know the book move, then the follow-up sequence would be fairly intuitive for you to kind of follow up deeply, and you can just jump in, something like that. So that's a typical sequence that you might consider. So if we talk about the most common sequence when you play this, typically you give Black three options. I believe D7 and E7 might be the most common response that you might have. Another option is for Black to play E7. So, regardless of where they play, a diagonal opening somehow always leads to a checkerboarding situation whereby you can control the mini diagonals in the mid game, and you can kind of place your opponent out of position. So, it's interesting to kind of explore this opening, even though it's fairly common. I guess most of the intermediate or advanced players would just follow the sequence, the book sequence, and kind of lead you up to this. So the other name for this opening is also Tanida. So named after the one of the famous Japanese players and a former world champion. He was previously the youngest world champion, and right now it's Keisuke Fukuji who has taken over that role. So this is, I would say, it's a fairly predictable opening, but it's easy for you to play. So if you're playing against somebody potentially stronger than you in basic skill level, I guess you might want to choose to use this opening against him so that you can kind of reach an even stage deeper into the game against a stronger opponent. So with that, I'll close off this video, and thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.